A sample for the number of TV episodes binged by 6 college students over the winter break are listed here. Find the sample variance and the sample standard deviation. To find the variance for a dataset, we have 2 different formulas. One formula is for sample data, and the other formula is for population data. For sample data, we use S squared to represent the sample variance. To find S squared, take each number from the dataset, subtract it by the sample mean. We call this the deviation. Now square each deviation, then add up the squares. And finally, divide the sum of the deviation squared by 1 less than the sample size, which is n-1. For population data, we use sigma square to represent the population variance. To find sigma square, take each number from the dataset, subtract it by the population mean. We call this the deviation. Now, square each deviation, then add up the squares. And finally, divide the sum of the deviation squared by the population size, which is capital N. Notice, the 2 formulas are almost the same with some differences. For sample data, we use S squared to represent the sample variance. The deviations are found by subtracting each number from the dataset by the sample mean. And we divide the sum of the deviation squared by 1 less than the sample size, which is n-1. For a population dataset, we use sigma squared to represent the population variance. The deviations are found by subtracting each number from the dataset by the population mean. And we divide the sum of the deviation squared by the population size, which is capital N. Back to the original question, we have a sample dataset and we are asked to find the sample variance. So, we will use the sample variance formula. First, write down the formula S squared equals the sum of the deviations squared divided by 1 less than the sample size. Note, we already know the sample size is 6. We just need to find the sum of the deviations squared. Now, to find the sum of the deviation squared by hand, construct a table with 3 columns. First, list each number from the dataset in the first column, and list the deviation for each number in the second column. Then, list the deviation squared for each number in the third column. Notice, we need the sample mean in order to do the calculations. You can check out the previous video on how to calculate the sample mean. Here, the sample mean is x bar equals 8.67. For the first number, the deviation is 7 minus 8.67 equals negative 1.67. For the second number, the deviation is 12 minus 8.67 equals 3.33. Now, square each deviation. Negative 1.67 squared equals 2.79. Note that the square of any number is always positive. Now, 3.33 squared equals 11.09. Notice that the deviation squared is always positive. Add up the deviation squared from the last column. And the sum of the deviation squared is 113.34. Finally, to calculate S squared, go back to the sample variance formula. Plug in the sum of the deviation squared to the numerator, which is 113.34. And in the denominator, 6 minus 1 is 5. So, take 113.34 divided by 5, and the answer is 22.67. So, S squared equals 22.67. In other words, the sample variance is 22.67. Once we have the variance, the standard deviation is really easy to find. For sample data, the sample standard deviation is S equals the square root of S squared. And for population data, the population standard deviation is sigma equals the square root of sigma squared. Since we already have the sample variance, to calculate the sample standard deviation, simply take the square root of our sample variance. So, S equals the square root of 22.67. And the square root of 22.67 is 4.76. So, S equals 4.76. In other words, the sample standard deviation is 4.76. So if a college student binged 5 TV episodes over the average of 9, there would be 1 standard deviation above the mean. Or if they binged 10 TV episodes over the average of 9, there would be 2 standard deviations above the mean.